Hi, this is Stuart Weems and welcome to the Investopoly podcast. My goal is to give you simple, easy to understand strategies, insights and tips to help you master the game of building wealth. Now, before we jump into this week's topic, I just wanted to remind you that I'm co-hosting a webinar next week, Wednesday lunchtime next week. And I've got some, what I think are really interesting charts and insights to share with attendees during that presentation. And the presentation's really aimed at sort of getting an understanding of, what possible investment returns that property investments might generate over the next 10 plus years. Anyway, there's a link in the show notes. If you haven't already registered for it, have a look at the description and see if it suits you, and it'd be great for you to join us. Okay, so let's get into this week's episode then. Look, most people struggle with knowing, what to do with their money. Where do they contribute? Do they upgrade their home? Do they put it into super? Do they go and buy an investment property? Do they invest in the share market or something else? In fact, it's a common challenge, and really the reason back in 2018 that I wrote my book Investopoly, because I thought if people understood sort of fundamental financial planning concepts, which I really solidified into the 8 rules as outlined in Investopoly, that they'd be able to figure this stuff out for themselves. And whilst everyone's situation is different, of course, and people have different goals and things that are going to change in their life and those sorts of things, there are some commonalities with respect to, when is it best to go and buy your first property? When do you start thinking about making additional super contributions and so forth? And so what I thought I'd do is share with you kind of a typical life cycle of an investor. And there's, as I said, there's some commonality, and it might help you kind of understand, what is that journey that you need to take and where are you in that journey? And maybe you can sort of back test it against yourself to see, are some of those things that I did at that stage of life. Okay, so let's start from the beginning, of course. So someone just starting out in their investment journey, and that can be, particularly them obviously finishing university or whatever studies they might have been doing and getting their first job. The first thing they must absolutely do is master cash flow management. It is just so critical to establish really good saving habits and patterns. And there's really 2 main reasons for that. Firstly, those good habits will serve you really for the rest of your life. They will really help you through different times of your life when you've got an excess amount of cash flow and to stop you from wasting it on things that aren't going to really improve your standard of living or generate wealth. And then there's going to be times where your cash flow is going to be a lot tighter. And knowing how to navigate those times is going to be really important to make sure that you don't get too stressed out and you kind of still enjoy the journey as it goes along. And the second reason why I want to encourage people right from the get-go to get good cash flow saving habits is it proves to yourself that you've got surplus cash flow to contribute to something else. And that something else, to my mind, should be a mortgage to buy your first property. And the reason why I say that buying a property is the first best step for someone that's just starting out is purely because of leverage. That is borrowings. People that are just starting out tend to have relatively good incomes or let's say good surplus incomes, but very weak from an asset-based perspective. And of course they are because, they've only just started working and so forth. So what they need to do is they really need to take steps to increase their net worth. And the best way to do that is borrowing to invest. And the best way to borrow to invest is investing in property. A lot more difficult and challenging to do it in the share market. So it's not really about property per se, because when we look at total returns from property and total returns from shares over the long run, they're relatively similar. There's not a lot of difference between them. The 2 main differences are, one, you can borrow a lot against and really leverage yourself. And the other difference is taxation. Now, whether you occupy that first property or rent it out really doesn't make a difference. It really comes down to making sure you approach that first property acquisition with an investment lens. So making sure you buy a property or the best quality property that your budget can afford, a property that has attributes that are going to drive capital growth in the long run. And as long as you don't make any compromises there and get the best quality asset you can buy, if you choose to occupy it, so be it. That's great. No capital gains tax. If from a cash flow perspective that's too difficult, say for people that are still living at home, that's fine. Rent it out. But the point is, make sure you buy something that's going to generate that good capital growth. And for people that are just starting out, and this is particularly for parents that might be listening in, if you've got children that will soon be of age to go and buy a property, and I imagine you'll be thinking, I'd like to educate them to buy sooner rather than later. Using a family guarantee is really the best way parents can help their kids into the property market. And I've got a link in the show notes there and the blog on the website to a blog that I wrote about family guarantees and why they're important. Okay, so the next phase then I would like to talk about is assuming you've started out, you've got your cash flow management under control, you've bought your first investment property. The next kind of phase in that life cycle is really before you start a family. Now, I'm making some generalizations here that people will have a spouse and that people will have children only because 75% of couples decide to do that. And again, I'm making generalizations in here. So if it doesn't apply to you, I apologize, and I'm no judgment there or anything like that. But the next phase is before you start a family. Now, when you buy your first property, you probably try to do that at a time as soon as possible. What I would find is that certainly in the first 5 to 10 years of someone's working career, their income increases substantially. They get promotions, and there's a big steep learning curve in that first 10 years of anyone's occupation, of course, and naturally their income reflects that. So it's very possible that, a couple of years after they've purchased their property, they've got a lot more surplus cash flow than what they had when they initially purchased that property. And if you're planning to start a family, you've got to realise that once you do that, your family income will reduce as one or both spouses take time off work to look after the child, and your expenses increase. So it's a big cash flow crunch, and it's really difficult for couples to build wealth during that period where they're starting a young family. So there is then a bit of a window of opportunity to potentially invest more or take some actions before you start that family that are going to greatly improve your asset base. Now, typically in that situation, to my mind, that would be a property-based transaction. And again, for the same reasons that I said property is the first step, because of the leverage. So if you've got that higher income and you've got that higher surplus cash flow, let's put it to work, and therefore let's either upgrade your existing property, maybe even potentially keep that existing property and then buy another one, whether that's an investment or a home, whether you sell the existing and just upgrade and buy, a sort of family home that you're looking to occupy for a period of time. Don't know what that looks like. It's going to depend on your circumstances, but really that you've got to recognise there is that window of opportunity before you start a family to really leverage yourself, while still making sure, of course, that whatever debt you take on is going to be affordable, particularly during those periods of time, those first 2 or 3 years of having a young child where your income's lower and your expenses are higher. Now, of course, that brings us to the next step or phase in the life cycle, which is really whilst you have young children. So that's really when they're not school-aged. You either got to use childcare, which is extraordinarily expensive. Private school fees get a bad rap from an expense perspective, but quite often childcare fees can be just as much, if not more, for some families, and it doesn't get as much attention as it deserves. But either way, I find that in the main, most people are going to really struggle to build wealth during this period of time, and they might feel like they're treading water. Unfortunately, that's all you could probably really do during this stage, and just acknowledging that there is that window of opportunity that you need to take either before you have children, and if you haven't done that, well, then there's that next window of opportunity, I guess, when income and expenses start normalising, which typically is around the time when your kids start school, prep and so forth. So that's really takes us to their fourth sort of stage in the life cycle when your kids are at school. Now, during this stage, as I said, you're probably experiencing better cash flow, and some of that cash flow might be contributed towards debt reduction, particularly if you upgraded your family home before you had children. You might find yourself in a situation where you do have quite a bit of non-tax deductible debt, so home loan debt, and therefore maybe cash flow should be directed towards some of that debt reduction, building buffers and so forth. But also a portion of your cash flow should be directed to growth assets if possible, because you're still young and you really want to have, give those growth assets a few decades, 2 or 3 or 4 decades to really generate that compounding capital growth. So if your borrowing capacity allows maybe and cash flow position allows, maybe that's buying an investment property. If taking on more debt now isn't the right move, then maybe it's some regular share investing or even some additional super contributions. Again, it's going to very much depend on your individual situation, risk tolerance and goals, but thinking about making regular investments in assets that are going to compound in value as soon as you possibly can is always going to serve you really well in the long run. Okay, so the next phase of retirement is just before private school fees kick in. Now then, again, this is assuming that you plan to send your kids to a private secondary school, which is pretty common, I must say. And if that is the case, that's something you're going to need to really think about. Because in that situation, that tends to be the second cash flow squeeze. The first one was when you first start a family. And particularly if you've got multiple children at private school all at once, that can be a really big cash flow crunch. So if that is your plan, then you might want to, and your strategy involves borrowing to invest, which I think a lot of people's strategies do, then making those investments maybe while your kids are in primary school, I should say, whilst the private school fees don't exist. Making those investments at that time, building a bit of a buffer and so forth, might be wise to do rather than leaving it too late. You might then find, hang on, these private school fees are now kicked in. All of a sudden, you don't really have the cash flow to be able to borrow to invest in property, and therefore you might end up having to wait until the private school's fees are finished before doing that. And of course, there's a time cost associated with that delay. So just something, a kind of word of warning, if that's on the cards, you really need to take that into account when developing your financial strategy. Okay, the second last phase of a typical investor life cycle is typically when kids are finished schooling, particularly if you've sent them to private schools. Not only do people's incomes tend to sort of max out at that stage, and people might be sort of in their late 40s, early 50s, late 50s, sort of in that range. Most people's incomes tend to maximise at that particular point in time. And then obviously if kids are, particularly if kids move out of home and you've got fewer expenses, then you can have a lot more surplus cash flow. And this stage is really very much a consolidation stage. So hopefully by this stage you've done all the borrowing, you've borrowed to invest in property, you've repaid a lot of your home loan and so forth. So you've got a bit of surplus cash flow. It's really about gradually reducing debt and then putting cash flow into ungeared investments. So that is obviously maximising super contributions, maybe even some regular share investing. But really the key part of this phase, which is just the last phase prior to retirement, is to really let your investments accumulate and benefit from compounding capital growth. Of course, you're going to need to think about the amount of debt that you take into retirement as well. So another consideration in this phase, maybe just as you approach retirement, is potentially selling down assets to reduce debt if you haven't been able to do so to a level that's acceptable with your cash flow. Okay, and that brings us to the final stage of the life cycle, which is retirement. Yay, you made it. So that's great. Most people are going to be able to draw super from age 60 onwards. In fact, I should say everyone will draw super from age 60 onwards if they're permanently retired from the workforce, or 65 if they're still working. And really the best way to utilise super in retirement is to draw a pension. an account-based pension, which means that you just draw a certain percentage of your balance each year. If you're aged between 60 and 65, the minimum amount's 4%. 65 to 75, it increases to 5% per year, but of course you can draw more if you need it. So you'll have an income stream from your super. How long that lasts obviously depends on how much you're spending, what your super balance was at the beginning, and what the investment returns are. But let's say that super really funds, let's call it the first phase of retirement. Again, whether that's the first 5, 10, 15, 20 years, who knows? And then what you hope then is that your remaining assets that you've invested in that have been outside super, so property and shares and cash savings, whatever it might be, will then fund the second phase of retirement. And the benefit there is it just allows you to hang on to those assets for maybe another 1, 2 or 3 decades to again let them really compound and generate much, much higher dollar value returns the longer that you keep those assets. And also, it means that you might feel, a little bit more comfortable spending a little bit more super in your, first 10 or 15 years of retirement while you're got the energy and health to go and travel and enjoy your money. And you might feel more comfortable spending that a bit more aggressively, knowing that you've got these other assets that are outside super still generating a lot of wealth. And of course, you can't take the money with you when you die. So at some point during retirement, you might want to consider making gifts, early inheritances, those sorts of things. Of course, you don't want to do that too soon and then potentially put your own retirement at risk. That's where, getting some good advice and making sure you're not compromising your own retirement makes a lot of sense. But why not sort of enjoy the benefits of those gifts while you're around rather than those assets passing when you pass away. Okay, that gives you a bit of a sort of summary or overview of a typical investor life cycle. So it's really about starting out, cash flow management, getting into property as soon as possible. As someone's cash and income increase as they work into their initial sort of career period, try and upgrade that property or buy a second one before they start a family. During starting a family, it's very difficult to build wealth. But once the kids are at school, again, you've got to go back on that bandwagon. And typically, again, depending on what you've done already, maybe it's more gearing because that really is the thing that's going to help you do all the heavy lifting for you. And then if you're going to send your kids to private school, certainly want to think about that and get as much investing done before that happens. And then really once the kids finish school, maybe even left home, that's really when you can spend time sort of consolidating your own position, reducing debt, boosting super, investing in other assets and so forth, which then leads us into retirement, drawing super, funding that first phase of retirement, then relying on other assets for the remainder. Okay, I hope that's been useful and gives you a bit of an idea of what your typical life cycle is. Of course, one size does not fit all, and so, this is a gross generalization. So, of course, you must develop your own strategy that's aligned to your own goals and financial circumstances. Okay, that's it for me this week. Until next week, bye for now.